On this hill, Thanksgiving 1924, revenue agents turned a family's life to ash. Martha Tallet was 63. She stood beside her husband Elmer and watched
Tennessee Fury. Granny Tallet slaughtered 19 revenue. Men who burned her husband's farm on Thanksgiving. The bloodiest act of vengeance against federal authority in Tennessee history and the most devastating campaign of retribution the Appalachian Mountains had ever witnessed from a woman defending her family's honor. This is the true story of Granny Tallet. Our story begins in the rugged mountain section of Cook County, Tennessee, known throughout the region as one of the most lawless and defiant corners of the state. The Great Smoky Mountains rise here in ancient majesty, their peaks shrouded in the blue mist that gives them their name, their hollows hiding secrets that outsiders were never meant to discover. The people who settled these mountains came seeking freedom from government interference, and their descendants maintained that spirit of independence through generations of conflict with authorities who sought to impose their will on a people who would not submit. You see, in Cook County in the 1920s, the making of whiskey was not merely an occupation, but a way of life that had sustained families since before the Revolution. The mountain people had been distilling corn into liquor for over a century, perfecting recipes passed down through generations, producing a product that was prized throughout the region for its quality and its potency. When the federal government declared this ancient practice illegal, first through taxation and later through prohibition, the mountain people did not stop making whiskey. They simply became more careful about hiding it. The conflict between moonshiners and revenue agents had been ongoing for decades by the time our story begins, a war of cat and mouse that claimed lives on both sides. The revenuers, as the mountain people called them, were federal agents charged with enforcing laws that the local population considered unjust and tyrannical. They raided stills, arrested moonshiners, and confiscated the product of labor that families depended on for survival. The moonshiners fought back as best they could, hiding their operations, posting lookouts, and sometimes resorting to violence when all else failed. The woman who would become known throughout Tennessee simply as Granny Tallet was born Orlena May Sutton in 1871 in a cabin on the banks of the French Broad River that her grandfather had built with his own hands. She was the sixth of 9 children, born into a family that had worked this land since the first settlers arrived, that had fought in every American war, that had buried 4 generations in the small cemetery on the ridge above the home place. The whiskey-making tradition was in her blood, part of her heritage as surely as her dark eyes and her stubborn disposition. That's right. Orlena Sutton had grown up watching her father and uncles tend the family still, had learned the secrets of fermentation and distillation before she learned to read, had absorbed the understanding that this craft was not criminal, but honorable, a skill passed down through generations that deserved respect rather than prosecution. She had seen her father arrested twice for making whiskey, had watched the family struggle during his imprisonment, had developed a hatred for the revenue agents that would only deepen with the years. Her childhood had been shaped by the rhythms of farm life and the demands of the family business. She had learned early that silence was essential, that the family's prosperity depended on keeping secrets that outsiders must never discover. She had developed a watchfulness that became second nature, an awareness of her surroundings that would later serve her well in very different circumstances. The skills of evasion and concealment that protected the family still would eventually protect her as she hunted men who had thought themselves hunters. The education she received was practical rather than academic, focused on the knowledge that mountain life required. She learned to read and write, to do arithmetic well enough to manage household accounts, to absorb the basic learning that the one-room schoolhouse could provide. But her real education came from her family, from the accumulated wisdom of generations who had survived in these mountains by their wits and their willingness to resist authority that sought to control them. Her religious faith was deep and sincere, shaped by the Baptist church where her family had worshipped for generations. She believed in God and heaven and the ultimate judgment that awaited all souls, believed that the righteous would be rewarded and the wicked punished. This faith would be tested by the events that were coming, would be transformed by grief into something that bore little resemblance to the gentle Christianity she had learned as a child. The God she would come to worship was a God of vengeance as well as love, a god who understood that some wrongs demanded answer. She had developed a reputation for determination that bordered on stubbornness, a refusal to accept defeat that sometimes frustrated those who loved her. When Orlena decided something needed to be done, she did it, regardless of obstacles or objections. This quality had served her well in building the family's prosperity, had helped her manage a household and a business with equal competence. It would serve her even better when she turned it toward darker purposes. Her marriage to a man named Ezra Tallet in 1889 had been a love match that joined two moonshining families into an alliance that would become legendary in Cock County. Ezra was a master distiller, known throughout the region for producing whiskey of exceptional quality, whiskey that commanded premium prices from buyers who came from as far as Knoxville and Asheville to acquire it. Together, Orlena and Ezra built an operation that was the envy of their neighbors, a still hidden so cleverly that it had never been discovered despite decades of searching by revenue agents. The children came steadily through the 1890s and into the new century, 8 of them in all, 5 sons and 3 daughters who grew up learning the family trade. The oldest was Thomas, born in 1890, a serious boy who took after his father in skill and temperament. Then came William in 1892, more adventurous than his brother, always looking for ways to expand the operation. Martha arrived in 1894, the first daughter, her mother's helper in all things. The other children followed in steady succession: James in 1896, Sarah in 1898, Robert in 1900, Elizabeth in 1903, and finally, young Ezra Jr. in 1905. Each child learned the craft, absorbed the importance of secrecy, understood that their prosperity depended on activities the government considered criminal. The Tallet homestead became a prosperous place by mountain standards, the whiskey income supplementing what the farm produced, allowing the family to live with a comfort that their neighbors often envied. The house that Ezra had built was larger than most in the county, with separate rooms for the children, a proper kitchen, and a parlor where the family gathered on evenings and holidays. The barn was well stocked, the fields productive, the livestock healthy. Everything about the place reflected the success that careful work and skillful management had produced. Ezra was careful, never greedy, producing just enough to meet demand without attracting the kind of attention that brought trouble. He had seen other moonshiners destroyed by their own ambition, had watched as operations that grew too large attracted federal attention that smaller operations avoided. He understood that survival depended on balance, on producing enough to prosper without producing so much that the authorities felt compelled to act. By 1925, Orlena Tallet was 54 years old, was known throughout Cock County as Granny Tallet, despite having only 4 grandchildren at the time. The title was one of respect rather than simple description, acknowledging her status as a matriarch whose wisdom and determination had helped build the Tallet family into one of the most successful clans in the region. She stood 5 feet 2 inches tall, weighed perhaps 110 pounds, and looked exactly like what she was, an aging mountain woman whose life of hard work had left its marks on her body but not on her spirit. The Tallet operation had survived Prohibition's arrival in 1920 by becoming even more careful, even more hidden, even more secretive about who was trusted with knowledge of their activities. Ezra had expanded production to meet the increased demand that Prohibition created, but he had also increased security, posting lookouts at every approach, developing signals that would warn of any stranger's arrival, building escape routes that would allow the family to disappear into the mountains at the first sign of trouble. The events that would define Granny Tallet's life and legacy began with a betrayal that still echoes through Cock County history. A cousin named Vernon Sutton, Orlena's own blood relation, had fallen into debt and had purchased his freedom by providing information to the revenue agents about the Tallet operation. Vernon told them everything: where the still was hidden, how to approach it without being detected, when the family would be most vulnerable. The information was worth a fortune to the agents, and Vernon collected his 30 pieces of silver without apparent remorse. Now, to understand what happened on Thanksgiving Day 1925, you need to understand the relationship between the Tallet family and the federal agents who had been hunting them for years. That's right. The lead agent assigned to Cock County was a man named Franklin Morse, a zealot who had made the destruction of mountain moonshining operations his personal crusade. Morse was 45 years old, a veteran of dozens of raids, a man who believed that he was doing God's work by enforcing laws that the mountain people considered unjust. He had tried to find the Tallet still for over 5 years, had failed repeatedly, and had developed an obsession with bringing the family to justice. When Vernon Sutton appeared at Morse's office with detailed information about the Tallet operation, the agent saw an opportunity to achieve the victory that had eluded him for so long. He assembled a force of 19 men, the largest raiding party ever organized in Cocker County, and planned an attack that would not merely destroy the still, but send a message that no moonshiner in the region would ever forget. The date he chose was Thanksgiving Day, when the family would be gathered for their holiday celebration, when their guard would be down, when the destruction would be most devastating. And that's when the tragedy began to unfold. You see, the Tallet family had gathered at the homestead for Thanksgiving, as they did every year, 3 generations coming together to celebrate the holiday and to give thanks for the blessings of the past year. Ezra had slaughtered a pig for the occasion, and the women had been cooking for days, preparing the feast that would feed over 30 people. The children were playing in the yard, the men were talking and laughing, and no one suspected that 19 armed men were approaching through the forest, guided by a traitor who knew exactly where to lead them. The raid began at mid-afternoon, just as the family was preparing to sit down to their Thanksgiving meal. The revenue agents emerged from the forest on all sides, rifles raised, shouting orders for everyone to freeze. The scene erupted into chaos as children screamed and adults scrambled to respond to the sudden threat. Ezra tried to reach for a weapon, and the first shots were fired, bullets striking the house and the outbuildings as the agents responded to what they perceived as resistance. The family had been caught completely by surprise, their normal vigilance abandoned for the holiday celebration. The lookouts, who would normally have warned of any approach, had been called in for the meal, leaving the approaches unwatched for the first time in years. The signals that would have alerted the family to danger were never given, because no one was watching for danger. It was a perfect moment for an attack, and Vernon Sutton had known it would be. The chaos of those first moments would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Children ran screaming in every direction, not knowing where to go or what to do. Women grabbed babies and tried to shield them, uncertain whether the shooting would continue or stop. Men reached for weapons that were not within reach, cursed themselves for their carelessness, tried to organize a response that the circumstances made impossible. What happened next would be disputed for years, with the agents claiming they had acted in self-defense, and the surviving family members insisting that the violence had been unprovoked and excessive. The facts that emerged from later investigations suggested that the agents had been primed for violence, that Morse had encouraged them to make an example of the Tallets, that the destruction they inflicted went far beyond what any legitimate law enforcement operation would have required. The agents set fire to the house, the barn, the outbuildings, everything that the Tallet family had built over generations. They destroyed the furniture, the clothing, the food that had been prepared for the Thanksgiving feast. They slaughtered the livestock, the pigs and chickens, and the milk cow that the family depended on for survival. They found the still and smashed it to pieces, poured out the whiskey, demolished the equipment that represented years of careful accumulation. But the worst was yet to come. Ezra Tallet, 60 years old and in failing health, had tried to save some of his family's possessions from the flames. He had rushed into the burning barn to rescue tools that represented his life's work, and the roof had collapsed on him, trapping him in the inferno. The agents made no effort to help him, standing by as his screams echoed across the hollow, watching as the man burned to death in the structure they had set ablaze. Some witnesses claimed they heard laughter, that the agents found entertainment in watching an old man die. Granny Tallet had been restrained by 2 agents during the raid, held back as her home burned, as her husband died, as everything she had worked for her entire life was destroyed. She had fought against their grip, had screamed and cursed, and begged them to let her save her husband, but they had held her fast, forcing her to witness the destruction without being able to do anything to stop it. The trauma of those hours would fuel a rage that would burn for years to come. The family was left with nothing. The house was gone, the outbuildings were gone, the livestock was gone. The stored food that would have sustained them through the winter was gone. Ezra was dead, his body so badly burned that there was little left to bury. The children and grandchildren who had gathered for a holiday celebration found themselves homeless, their lives destroyed by men who had then simply walked away, congratulating themselves on a job well done. The night of Thanksgiving 1925, as the family huddled in a neighbor's barn trying to comprehend what had happened to them, Granny Tallet made a vow that would define the rest of her life. She would kill them, every man who had participated in the raid, every agent who had watched her husband burn, every federal officer who had destroyed her home and left her family with nothing. She would find them, and she would kill them one by one until the debt was paid in full. 19 men had come to her home that day. 19 men would die before she was finished, and that vow, spoken in the darkness of a borrowed barn, on a night that should have been filled with gratitude, would be fulfilled beyond anything Granny Tallet herself could have imagined. The planning process began immediately, driven by a rage that Granny Tallet made no effort to conceal from her family. Her sons tried to discourage her, argued that revenge would only bring more trouble, pointed out that she was 54 years old and in no condition to wage war against the federal government. She listened to their objections and dismissed them without discussion. Her husband was dead. Her home was destroyed. Her life's work was ashes. Nothing her sons could say would change what she intended to do. The intelligence she gathered over the following months was comprehensive and detailed. She learned the names of every agent who had participated in the raid, tracked their movements, studied their habits, identified their vulnerabilities. Vernon Sutton, the traitor whose information had made the raid possible, was first on her list, but she decided to save him for last, to let him live in fear while she eliminated the others, to make him understand that his betrayal had consequences he could not escape. The weapons she acquired came from various sources, family members and sympathizers who understood what she intended and who were willing to help. Her husband's rifle, her father's shotgun, pistols that were purchased through intermediaries who asked no questions. She was an excellent shot, had been hunting since childhood, had the patience and the skill that the campaign would require. Her age and appearance were advantages rather than obstacles, allowing her to move through the world without attracting the suspicion that a younger person might have faced. The first killing came on a cold night in January 1926, 2 months after the raid that had destroyed her life. The target was a young agent named Thomas Henderson, who had been seen laughing as Ezra Tallet burned in the barn. Henderson lived in Newport, boarding with a family that had no connection to moonshining, confident in his safety among people who supported his work. He was wrong about that safety. Granny Tallet approached his boarding house after midnight, waited until the household was asleep, and shot Henderson through the window of his room as he lay in bed. The bullet struck him in the head, killing him instantly, and Granny was gone before anyone could respond to the sound of the gunshot. The killing was attributed to moonshiners seeking revenge for some unspecified grievance, but no one connected it to the elderly woman who had been seen in town earlier that day, asking directions to the general store. The second killing came 3 weeks later, targeting another agent who had participated in the raid. This man, named Robert Carlyle, was found shot dead on a mountain road. His car stopped as if he had pulled over to investigate something, his body slumped over the steering wheel with a bullet hole in his chest. The pattern was beginning to emerge, but the authorities could not yet see it, could not imagine that the killings were connected or that an elderly woman might be responsible. The third and fourth killings came in quick succession in late February 1926, demonstrating that Granny Tallet's campaign was accelerating. The victims were both agents who had been present at the raid, both killed by gunfire, both found in circumstances that suggested careful planning and patient execution. The federal office in Knoxville began to take notice, began to wonder if someone was systematically targeting agents who had participated in specific operations. That's right. Granny Tallet continued her campaign through the spring of 1926, striking with a regularity that kept her enemies constantly off balance. The fifth agent died in March, found floating in the French Broad River with a bullet wound in his back. He had been fishing alone, confident that no one would disturb him in a spot he had used for years. Granny had watched him for days, learned his routine, waited for the perfect moment when no witnesses would be present. The sixth was ambushed on a remote road in April, his car riddled with bullets from multiple angles that suggested the shooter had taken time to ensure the job was done thoroughly. This victim had been one of the men who had set fire to the barn, who had lit the match that started the blaze that killed Ezra. Granny had saved him for a particularly thorough killing, had wanted to make sure he understood why he was dying before the final bullets ended his awareness. The seventh and eighth died on the same night in May, killed in their homes in a coordinated attack that demonstrated capabilities no one had suspected the killer possessed. Both men had been members of the same unit, had ridden together to the Tallet homestead on Thanksgiving Day, had congratulated each other afterward on a job well done. Granny had tracked them to their homes in different towns, had recruited help from family members who were willing to participate, had orchestrated a simultaneous strike that left both men dead before either could warn the other. The federal response to the killings became increasingly desperate as the death toll mounted. Additional agents were assigned to the case, supervisors traveled from Washington to coordinate the investigation, rewards were offered for information that might identify the killer. But the mountain community closed ranks around Granny Tallet, refusing to cooperate with authorities who were seen as enemies rather than protectors. The wall of silence was absolute, impenetrable, a barrier that no amount of pressure could breach. The terror that Granny created spread through the federal enforcement apparatus like a disease. Agents who had participated in the Tallet raid began to request transfers, to claim illness, to find reasons why they could not continue working in the Tennessee mountains. Some resigned entirely, deciding that government service was not worth dying for. The Bureau of Prohibition found it increasingly difficult to staff positions in Cook County, as word spread about what was happening to agents who worked there. Each killing was executed with care that reflected Granny Tallet's years of experience evading detection. She knew how to move through the mountains without leaving traces, how to approach her targets without being seen, how to disappear after striking without anyone being able to follow. The skills that had kept the family still hidden for decades now served a different purpose, protecting her as she hunted men who had thought themselves hunters. The investigation into the killings eventually recognized the pattern that connected them. A federal agent named James Whitmore was assigned to coordinate the response, and he quickly identified the common factor. All the victims had participated in the Thanksgiving raid on the Tallet homestead. Whitmore understood that someone was systematically eliminating the agents involved in that operation, and he began to suspect that the killer might be connected to the family that had been destroyed. The surveillance of the Tallet family began in June 1926, with agents watching the temporary housing where Granny Tallet and her sons were living. They observed her movements, noted her activities, looked for any evidence that might connect her to the killings. What they saw was an elderly woman going about the ordinary business of survival, attending church, visiting neighbors, showing no signs of the rage that burned inside her. The ninth killing came on a night when Granny Tallet had been under observation for weeks. She had identified the watchers almost immediately, had adapted her methods to account for their presence, had developed ways of striking that the surveillance could not detect. Her sons served as intermediaries, carrying messages, providing transportation, creating alibis that seemed unassailable. The family operation that had hidden moonshine for decades now hid something far more dangerous. The 10th and 11th killings followed the same pattern, occurring while Granny Tallet was visibly elsewhere, her presence confirmed by witnesses who had no idea they were providing an alibi for murder. Agent Whitmore was forced to admit that his surveillance had failed to produce any useful evidence, that whoever was killing his colleagues was too clever to be caught by conventional methods. The investigation was not abandoned, but its focus shifted to other possibilities, and that's when Granny Tallet resumed her direct involvement. The 12th killing came in August 1926, targeting Franklin Morse himself, the leader of the raid who had watched Ezra Tallet burn without lifting a finger to help. Granny had saved him for later in her campaign, had wanted him to experience the fear of watching his colleagues die one by one, had wanted him to understand that his turn was coming and that nothing could prevent it. When she finally came for him, she took her time. Morse was found in his home in Knoxville, dead from multiple gunshot wounds that suggested he had been shot first in the legs, then in the arms, then finally in the chest. The wounds indicated that he had been alive for some time after the initial shots, that he had suffered before the final bullet ended his pain. Granny Tallet had wanted him to suffer, and she had ensured that he did. The killing of Morse elevated the case to national attention, drawing coverage from newspapers across the country. A federal agent had been murdered in his own home, killed in a manner that suggested torture, and the authorities had no idea who was responsible. The investigation intensified, with additional agents assigned to the case, additional resources devoted to finding the killer. But Granny Tallet remained invisible, protected by a community that shared her hatred of the revenuers and that would never betray her, regardless of what the government offered. The 13th killing came in September 1926, the 14th in October, the 15th in November. By the first anniversary of the raid, 15 of the 19 agents who had participated were dead, and the survivors had fled Cock County, seeking safety in cities where they hoped the killer could not find them. But Granny Tallet found them anyway, tracking them through networks of information that extended far beyond the mountains, following trails that led her to places she had never visited, but where her reputation had preceded her. The 16th agent died in Nashville, shot through the heart as he walked to his car after leaving a restaurant. The 17th was killed in Memphis, found in his apartment with a single bullet wound to the head. The 18th died in Chattanooga, his body discovered in an alley behind the boarding house where he had been hiding under an assumed name. Granny Tallet's reach extended across the state, demonstrating that distance provided no protection against her vengeance. The 19th killing came on Thanksgiving Day, 1926, exactly 1 year after the raid that had started everything. The target was Vernon Sutton, the traitor whose betrayal had made the raid possible, the cousin who had sold his family for money. Granny had saved him for last, had wanted him to spend the year knowing that his time was running out, had wanted the anniversary of his betrayal to be the date of his death. Vernon had tried to flee, had left Tennessee entirely, had hidden in Kentucky under a name he thought no one would connect to him. But Granny found him, tracked him through relatives who owed her more than they owed the man who had betrayed their blood. She arrived at his hiding place on Thanksgiving morning, found him alone in the cabin where he had been staying, and spent several hours with him before ending his life. What passed between them during those hours was never recorded, known only to Granny and to the man she killed. But when Vernon's body was found, the evidence suggested that his death had been neither quick nor merciful. He had been shot in multiple places, wounds that were designed to cause pain rather than death, and the final bullet had come only after he had suffered considerably. The message was clear. Betrayal of family carried consequences that mere death could not adequately address. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the campaign ended. Granny Tallet was arrested 3 weeks after Vernon's death, identified through a witness who had seen her in Kentucky and who had been persuaded to talk by the promise of reward money. The case against her was built on circumstantial evidence, witness testimony that placed her near several of the killings, and the obvious motive that the raid on her home provided. She did not deny what she had done, seemed almost proud of it, faced her accusers with a defiance that made clear she had no regrets. The trial of Granny Tallet became the most sensational criminal proceeding in Tennessee history, drawing national attention and spectators who traveled from across the country to witness the proceedings. The courtroom was packed every day, with crowds gathering outside to follow the testimony through updates provided by those who had seats inside. Newspapers covered every development, making Granny Tallet a celebrity whose story was known to millions who had never heard of Cock County. The scene inside the courtroom was remarkable for its contrasts. The defendant was a small, elderly woman dressed in plain mountain clothing, her grey hair pulled back in a simple bun, her face lined with the evidence of a hard life. She sat quietly through the proceedings, her expression revealing nothing of what she felt about the testimony being presented. Beside her sat lawyers who had volunteered to represent her, men who believed that her case represented something larger than a simple murder trial. The spectators included journalists from newspapers across the country, curious observers who had traveled hundreds of miles to see the infamous Granny Tallet, and supporters from the mountain community who packed the galleries whenever space permitted. The latter group was notable for its silence, their presence making a statement without words. Their numbers demonstrating that Granny was not alone, that her community stood behind her regardless of what the law might say. The prosecution was led by a federal attorney named Charles Morrison, a skilled lawyer who understood that the case required careful handling. He could not afford to appear sympathetic to the defendant, but he also could not ignore the circumstances that had driven her to action. His strategy focused on the facts of the killings themselves, on the planning and premeditation they revealed, on the cold-blooded efficiency with which 19 men had been eliminated. The prosecution presented its case methodically, connecting Granny to the killings through evidence that demonstrated planning, opportunity and motive. They called witnesses who had seen her near several of the crime scenes, who had sold her ammunition, who had noticed her unusual travels in the months of her campaign. They presented ballistic evidence linking bullets from multiple killings to weapons found in her possession. They built a case that was legally sound, supported by evidence that pointed unmistakably to her guilt. They portrayed her as a cold-blooded killer who had murdered 19 men in calculated revenge, who had shown no mercy and no remorse, who had demonstrated a capacity for violence that made her a danger to society. Morrison described each killing in detail, emphasizing the patience and planning that had gone into each one, arguing that this was not a crime of passion, but a systematic campaign of extermination. He demanded the death penalty, arguing that the scope and brutality of her crimes warranted the ultimate punishment. The defense was led by a local attorney named Thomas Mitchell, a man who had grown up in Cock County and who understood the community from which Granny came. Mitchell had taken the case without fee, believing that it represented an opportunity to put the federal government's tactics on trial. He was assisted by a team of volunteer lawyers who shared his commitment, creating a defense that was far more capable than anyone had expected. The defense argued that Granny had been driven to her actions by circumstances that left her no other choice. They described the raid that had destroyed her home, the death of her husband in flames that the agents had set, the devastation that had left her family with nothing. They presented witnesses who testified to the agents' brutality, who described the laughing and the celebration as the Tallet homestead burned. They asked the jury to understand, if not to forgive, what Granny Tallet had done. The jury deliberated for 3 days, longer than anyone had expected, suggesting that the decision was not as straightforward as either side had hoped. When they finally returned, their verdict reflected the complexity of the case and the impossibility of simple judgments, guilty of voluntary manslaughter on 19 counts with a recommendation for the minimum possible sentence. The verdict was a compromise, an acknowledgement that Granny had committed terrible acts, while simultaneously recognizing the circumstances that had driven her to them. The judge, a man named William Harrison, who had no connection to either the moonshining community or the federal government, sentenced her to 19 concurrent terms of 3 years each, with eligibility for parole after 2 years. It was the most lenient sentence the law would allow, and it meant that Granny Tallet, at 56 years old, might actually live to see freedom again. Granny Tallet served 18 months at the Tennessee State Penitentiary for Women before being released on parole in 1928. She returned to Cock County, to the mountains she had never wanted to leave, to the land where her husband was buried, and where her children had rebuilt a home from the ashes of what the agents had destroyed. She never spoke publicly about the campaign that had made her famous, never granted interviews to the journalists who sought her out, never confirmed or denied the details that had emerged during her trial. The years following her release were quiet ones, marked by the rhythms of mountain life that had always defined her existence. She lived with her eldest son and his family, helped raise grandchildren who had been born while she was in prison, resumed her place as the matriarch of a clan that had been tested by fire and had emerged stronger. The whiskey-making resumed as well, more carefully than ever, hidden from authorities who no longer had the will or the resources to pursue the Tallets. She died in 1942 at the age of 71, passing peacefully in her sleep in the cabin that her family had rebuilt on the site of the home that had been destroyed. She was buried beside her husband Ezra in the family cemetery on the ridge, the grave marked by a stone that bore only her name and dates, no epitaph that might summarize a life that defied simple description. The funeral was private, limited to family, conducted without the publicity that had accompanied her trial. The aftermath of Granny Tallet's campaign reshaped federal enforcement in the Tennessee mountains for a generation. The exposure of the agent's conduct during the Thanksgiving raid, which came out in detail during the trial, generated outrage that reached all the way to Washington. Congressional hearings were held to examine enforcement tactics, with witnesses testifying about abuses that had been occurring for years without oversight or accountability. Investigations were launched into the tactics used by revenue agents, revealing patterns of excessive force and destruction that extended far beyond the Tallet case. Other families came forward with stories of similar treatment, of homes burned, of livestock slaughtered, of property destroyed, far in excess of what any legitimate law enforcement operation would require. The accumulated testimony created a picture of systematic abuse that could not be ignored. New guidelines were established for conducting raids, limiting the destruction that agents could inflict and requiring proportional response to the threats they encountered. Supervisors who had encouraged excessive violence found their careers quietly ended, transferred to desk jobs, or encouraged to resign. The message from Washington was clear. The kind of tactics that had been used against the Tallets would no longer be tolerated. The raid itself became a cautionary tale within the Bureau of Prohibition, an example of what happened when agents allowed their zeal to overcome their judgment. Training programs were modified to emphasize proportional response, to discourage the kind of punitive destruction that had characterized the Tallet raid. New agents were taught about the Tallet case, warned about the consequences of similar conduct, reminded that the communities they operated in were composed of American citizens who deserved respect. The legal reforms that followed extended beyond enforcement tactics. New procedures were established for handling complaints against agents, providing mechanisms for accountability that had previously been absent. Citizens who believed they had been mistreated could now seek redress through channels that actually functioned, could expect that their complaints would be investigated rather than ignored. The political impact of the case contributed to the growing movement against prohibition itself. The Tallet trial exposed the ugly reality of enforcement to audiences who had previously been unaware of what was happening in their name. Newspapers editorialized about the human cost of the liquor laws, about families destroyed, and lives lost in the pursuit of a policy that seemed increasingly difficult to justify. The case became a symbol for those who argued that prohibition had failed, that the cure was worse than the disease. The moonshining community of Cocky County drew its own lessons from the Granny Tallet story. Her campaign had demonstrated that the moonshiners were not helpless, that they could strike back against those who persecuted them, that the power of the federal government had limits that could be tested. The agents who remained became more careful, more respectful, less likely to engage in the kind of excessive violence that had provoked Granny's response. The gravesite where Granny and Ezra Tallet are buried became a place of pilgrimage for those who remembered the story, visited by people who wanted to pay respects to a woman whose vengeance had captured something essential about the mountain spirit. The stones are simple, weathered by decades of rain and wind, but visitors continue to come, leaving flowers and tokens that acknowledge a sacrifice and a rage that time has not diminished. The songs that emerged from the Granny Tallet story varied widely in their approach and message. Some were straightforward ballads that recounted the events in chronological order, from the raid through the campaign to the trial. These songs celebrated Granny's determination, described her killings in detail that bordered on admiration, portrayed her as a symbol of mountain resistance to federal tyranny. They were sung in taverns and at gatherings, becoming part of the oral tradition that preserved mountain history. The first songs appeared within weeks of the trial's conclusion, composed by local musicians who had followed the case closely. These early ballads were simple, built on traditional melodies with new words that told Granny's story. They spread through the mountains by word of mouth, learned by one community and carried to the next, modified and embellished as they traveled until multiple versions existed, each emphasizing different aspects of the story. One popular ballad described the Thanksgiving raid itself, painting a vivid picture of the destruction and the terror that Granny had witnessed. The song opened with the family gathered for their holiday meal, happy and unsuspecting, giving thanks for the blessings of the past year. It described the agents emerging from the forest, the chaos that followed, the flames that consumed everything the family had built. The song captured the agents' brutality, the burning of the home, the death of Ezra in the flames. The most powerful verses described Ezra's death in detail that made listeners feel they were present. The song imagined his thoughts as he ran into the burning barn, his determination to save what he could, his horror as the roof collapsed around him. It described his screams echoing across the hollow, the agents watching without lifting a finger to help, the laughter that some witnesses claimed to have heard. These verses were designed to provoke rage, to make listeners understand why Granny had done what she did. The song concluded with Granny's transformation from victim to avenger, from wife to widow to killer, from ordinary mountain woman to force of nature. It portrayed her standing amid the ashes of her home, making her vow of vengeance, beginning the campaign that would claim 19 lives. The image became iconic, repeated in countless retellings, a symbol of what happens when authority pushes too far. Another song told the story from the perspective of the agents, describing their growing terror as their colleagues died one by one around them. This song was darker than most, capturing the fear that must have consumed men who understood that death was hunting them. It described sleepless nights and constant vigilance, the sound of every creaking board or rustling leaf becoming a potential warning of doom approaching. The song imagined the agents' attempts to flee, their efforts to hide, their final understanding that nothing could protect them from the vengeance they had earned. It described men who had once swaggered through the mountains, now cowering in cities, looking over their shoulders constantly, jumping at shadows. It portrayed their deaths in detail, each one a small story of hubris meeting its inevitable end. A third song focused on Vernon Sutton, the traitor whose betrayal had started everything. This song was the most bitter, condemning the cousin who had sold his family for money, describing his year of waiting for the death he knew was coming, imagining his final hours with Granny before she ended his life. The verses about Vernon dripped with contempt, portraying him as the lowest form of humanity, a man who had violated the most sacred bonds for 30 pieces of silver. It served as a warning to others who might consider similar betrayals, a reminder that the mountains had long memories and that treachery was never forgiven. The final verses described Vernon's death in detail that suggested the songwriter had knowledge of what actually happened, though whether this was true or merely imagined, no one could say. The song served its purpose regardless, making clear that betrayal carried consequences that extended far beyond the grave. A fourth song took a different approach, focusing not on the violence but on the love that had driven it. This song portrayed Granny's devotion to Ezra, their decades of marriage, the partnership they had built together. It described her grief at his death, the emptiness that consumed her, the rage that grew from the ashes of her sorrow. This song was more sympathetic than the others, portraying Granny not as a killer, but as a woman who had loved deeply and lost terribly, who had responded to that loss in the only way she could imagine. The most famous of all the Granny Tallet songs was composed several years after her death by a professional musician who had traveled to Cock County to research the story. This song combined elements of all the earlier ballads into a comprehensive narrative that told the complete story with skill and emotional power. It has been recorded and performed for nearly a century, becoming a standard in the repertoire of mountain musicians, carrying Granny's story to audiences who never knew her name. Historians who have studied the Granny Tallet case have reached varying conclusions about its significance and meaning. Some have analyzed it as an example of resistance to federal overreach, arguing that the agent's conduct during the raid justified whatever response it provoked. They note that the moonshining community had been persecuted for generations by laws they considered unjust, that the violence of the enforcement had created a culture of resistance that Granny Tallet embodied in its most extreme form. Her campaign, they argue, was not merely personal vengeance, but a political statement about the limits of acceptable government behavior. These scholars have traced the roots of mountain resistance back to the Whiskey Rebellion of the 1790s, when farmers in western Pennsylvania had violently resisted federal excise taxes on distilled spirits. The tradition of defiance extended through the decades, manifesting in different forms as circumstances changed, but never disappearing entirely. Granny Tallet stood at the end of a long line of resistors, people who had refused to accept that distant governments had the right to control how they lived and worked. The economic analysis of mountain moonshining reveals why the practice persisted despite decades of enforcement. The soil in these hollows was too poor for most crops, the terrain too rugged for efficient farming, the markets too distant for perishable goods. But corn could be grown, and corn could be converted to whiskey, and whiskey could be transported over bad roads to markets where it commanded good prices. Moonshining was not merely tradition, but economic survival. The only way many families could generate the cash they needed for goods they could not produce themselves. Others have focused on gender dynamics, noting that Granny's status as an elderly woman gave her advantages that younger or male perpetrators would not have enjoyed. No one suspected that a 54-year-old grandmother could be capable of killing 19 men, and this assumption of harmlessness allowed her to operate with a freedom that would have been impossible otherwise. Her campaign challenged expectations about who was capable of violence and for what reasons, demonstrating that the protective instincts associated with femininity could manifest as deadly force when directed at those who had harmed her family. Feminist scholars have examined Granny Tallet's story as evidence of women's capacity for agency, even in patriarchal societies that denied them formal power. Denied access to courts and legislatures, excluded from the official channels through which grievances might be addressed, she created her own form of justice. Her campaign was not an abandonment of feminine values, but an expression of them. The protective mother extended to encompass the protection of her husband's memory and her community's honor. Still others have examined the case as a turning point in the history of prohibition enforcement, the moment when the federal government was forced to acknowledge that its tactics had consequences. The deaths of 19 agents, combined with the publicity generated by the trial, created pressure for reform that might not have existed otherwise. Granny Tallet's campaign, however brutal, achieved results that years of peaceful resistance had failed to produce. The reforms that followed saved other families from experiencing what the Tallets had experienced. The legal scholars who have studied the case have focused on the trial itself, particularly the jury's decision to convict on voluntary manslaughter rather than murder. This verdict represented a significant departure from the legal standards that should have applied, a recognition that the community valued Granny Tallet's grievance more than it valued strict adherence to law. The jury nullification, though never explicitly acknowledged, demonstrated the limits of legal authority in communities where that authority was not respected. You see, what Granny Tallet did cannot be justified by any conventional legal or moral framework. She killed 19 men, most of them shot without warning, without any opportunity to surrender or defend themselves. The fact that her victims had participated in the destruction of her home and the death of her husband does not eliminate the fact that she acted as judge, jury, and executioner, taking lives that were not hers to take. Any society that hopes to maintain order must condemn vigilante killing, regardless of the grievances that motivate it. And yet her story cannot be simply condemned, reduced to a tale of criminality that teaches only the obvious lesson that murder is wrong. She was a woman whose husband had been burned alive by men who faced no accountability for their actions, whose home had been destroyed by agents who celebrated the destruction, whose life had been shattered by a government that seemed to view mountain people as enemies rather than citizens. The system that should have protected her family had instead become the instrument of their destruction. What options did she have? What would anyone do when faced with such loss and such complete absence of justice? Her story challenges us to consider the relationship between law and justice, between what is legal and what is right. The raid on the Tallet homestead violated no federal law, was conducted by agents operating within the scope of their authority. But it was not just. The excessive destruction, the celebration of violence, the death of Ezra Tallet in flames that no one tried to extinguish, these actions were legal, but they were not right. Granny Tallet created accountability where none existed, demonstrated that power had limits, and forced changes that benefited everyone who lived under the threat of such raids. The specific circumstances that produced the Granny Tallet story, prohibition, and the moonshining culture it criminalized have passed into history. The laws that made whiskey illegal were repealed in 1933, and the federal agents who once hunted moonshiners turned their attention to other targets. But the underlying questions that her story raises have not disappeared. When does resistance to unjust authority become justified? What do we owe to those who suffer at the hands of governments that are supposed to protect them? How do we balance the need for order against the demands of justice? The descendants of the Tallet family still live in those Tennessee mountains, carrying the memory of Granny through the generations. Family reunions include visits to her grave, moments of reflection on a woman whose name still commands respect throughout the region. The whiskey-making tradition continues, legal now but carrying echoes of the time when it required courage and secrecy. The mountains that sheltered Granny as she hunted her prey still shelter her descendants, still keep their secrets, still remember what happened during those terrible years. The mountains of Cock County remain today, much as they were in 1925, ancient and patient and indifferent to human drama. The hollows still shelter families who have lived there for generations, descendants of the people who gathered for Granny's funeral and mourned a woman whose life had encompassed both terrible loss and terrible vengeance. The French Broad River still flows through the valley, carrying water that has witnessed centuries of human drama downstream toward the Tennessee River and eventually to the sea. The community that surrounds the old Tallet land has changed in many ways since 1925, connected now to the broader world through roads and communications that were impossible in Granny's time. Young people leave for cities, seeking opportunities that the mountains cannot provide, and the population of the county has declined with each passing decade. The moonshining culture that produced the conflict has largely faded, replaced by legal distilleries that produce whiskey for tourists who want to taste authentic mountain spirits. But the memory of what happened persists, kept alive by family members who continue to tell the story, who bring their children and grandchildren to visit the graves, who ensure that each new generation understands what Granny Tallet did and why she did it. The story has become a kind of inheritance, passed down like the family Bible or the deeds to the land, a possession that cannot be measured in monetary terms, but that has value beyond calculation. The site where the Tallet farm once stood has been reclaimed by forest in the decades since the burning. Nothing remains of the house or barn or outbuildings that the agents destroyed, nothing visible to mark the place where Ezra Tallet collapsed and died. But those who know the history can find it, can stand on ground that was once a homestead, can imagine the flames rising and the life that was destroyed. The earth remembers even when the structures are gone. The gravesite where Granny and Ezra rest together is maintained by descendants who could not bear to see it fall into disrepair. Fresh flowers appear regularly, placed by hands that never knew the people buried there, but that honor their memory anyway. The stones have been cleaned and restored over the years, the inscriptions kept legible against the erosion of weather and time. It remains a place of pilgrimage, visited by people who have heard the story and who want to acknowledge it in some tangible way. The mountains keep their secrets, holding the memory of Granny Tallet close, like they hold the morning mist and the evening shadows and the countless other stories of those who have lived and died among these ancient peaks. It is the story of love, and what love becomes when it watches the beloved destroyed by those who face no consequences. It is the story of age, and what age can accomplish when determination replaces the physical strength of youth. It is the story of community, and how communities protect their own against forces that threaten to destroy them. It is finally a story without easy answers, a tale that resists simple judgments and invites reflection on questions that have no comfortable resolution. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand where Granny Tallet stood, to see the ridge where she and Ezra are buried, to walk the mountains where she hunted the men who had taken everything from her? Would you breathe the same mountain air, feel the same wind that has blown through these hollows for centuries, sense the presence of history that seems to linger in certain places? The journey is not easy. The roads are narrow and winding, and the cemetery where the Tallets rest is difficult to find without a guide who knows the way. But those who make the effort say it is worth it. That standing in that place and knowing that history brings something into focus that cannot be captured in words or photographs. The drive from Knoxville takes several hours, winding through mountains that seem to rise higher with each passing mile. The pavement gives way to gravel in places, and the gravel gives way to dirt roads that require careful navigation. The smoky mountain mist that gives the region its name settles over the peaks and hollows, creating an atmosphere that feels timeless, unchanged from the days when Granny Tallet walked these same paths, hunting men who thought themselves hunters. The community welcomes visitors who come with respect, who want to learn rather than gawk, who understand that they are entering a place with deep history and strong traditions. The people who live here are proud of their heritage, proud of the ancestors who refused to submit to authority they considered unjust, proud of the woman who demonstrated that mountain people would not be pushed too far without pushing back. They will share their stories if asked politely, will point the way to the graves, will help visitors understand the context that makes Granny Tallet's story comprehensible. The cemetery where Granny and Ezra rest sits on a hillside overlooking a hollow that was once filled with homesteads like theirs. Most of those homesteads are gone now, reclaimed by forest or replaced by different structures, but the cemetery endures, maintained by descendants who understand its importance. The stones date back generations, recording names and dates that tell the story of families who lived and died in these mountains. The Tallet stones are among the most visited, marked by the tokens and flowers that pilgrims leave behind. Standing at those graves, looking out over the mountains that Granny knew so intimately, one can almost feel her presence lingering in the wind that rustles through the trees. She is gone, of course, has been gone for decades now, but what she did remains, preserved in memory and in song, and in the lessons that her story teaches. The questions she forces us to ask, about justice and vengeance and the limits of what any person should be expected to endure, have no easy answers, which is perhaps why her story continues to resonate so deeply with all who hear it. The story of Granny Tallet endures because it speaks to something fundamental in the human experience. It is the story of love and what love becomes when it watches the beloved destroyed by those who face no consequences. It is the story of age, and what age can accomplish when determination replaces the physical strength of youth. It is the story of community, and how communities protect their own against forces that threaten to destroy them. It is, finally, a story without easy answers, a tale that resists simple judgments and invites reflection on questions that have no comfortable resolution. The lessons of her story remain relevant even today. The tension between government authority and individual liberty has not disappeared, and the question of what citizens can do when official channels fail them remains as urgent as ever. Granny Tallet's answer, the taking of lives in response to lives taken, cannot be endorsed as a model for others to follow. But her story reminds us that such answers become possible when systems fail completely, when those who are supposed to provide justice instead become instruments of injustice. The mountains keep their secrets, holding the memory of Granny Tallet close, like they hold the morning mist and the evening shadows, and the countless other stories of those who have lived and died among these ancient peaks. Her story will continue to be told as long as people remember what happened in Cock County during those terrible years, as long as love and loyalty drive people to do terrible things in defense of those they cherish, as long as systems fail and ordinary people find their own extraordinary ways to respond to that failure. She is gone now, dust mingling with the earth beside the husband she loved and cherished, and ultimately avenged. But what she did echoes still through time and will continue to echo for generations yet to come. And that, my friend, is the true story of Granny Tallet, who slaughtered 19 federal revenue men after they burned her husband's farm on Thanksgiving and watched him die in the flames they had deliberately set. A story of love and devastating loss, of patience and fury, of justice found where the law would not provide it, and vengeance achieved where official channels had completely failed. The mountains remember her name and her deeds, and her extraordinary sacrifice, and through them so do we all now and for countless generations to come, as long as these ancient peaks endure and people gather to hear tales of mountain justice and mountain vengeance.